Hey, this is Justin, and today I'm going to walk you through how I edit the Milky Way. First things first, you really have to learn how to shoot the Milky Way. It's the combination of knowing how to shoot it and how to edit it that will produce superior results to a lot of stuff that you see online. A lot of this is just details, so follow along. This is an image I shot in the ancient bristlecone pine forest. I shot this with a Sony A7RIII Mark III and the Sony 16-35G Master, the f2.8. Because there's hardly any light pollution here, I exposed at 6400 ISO. If there's a lot of light pollution, I would lower that down to save some of the highlight detail and simply boost up the exposure slider later to compensate for that light loss. I shot this at 16mm, the widest setting possible for that lens, f2.8, so wide open, and I did a 25-second exposure because I feel I get a sharper result in the stars by shooting at 25 seconds and not 30 seconds. So the first things first, we're looking at this image now in Lightroom. It's pretty dark. The shadow area is pretty dark. The sky's kind of dark. The corners have a lot of vignetting on them. So we're going to go ahead and adjust all this. I'm going to start with the vignetting. I'm going to come down here. I'm going to check remove chromatic aberration and also enable profile correction. And you can see that got rid of the distortion and the vignetting on the edges. Next thing I want to do is go up and change the white balance. This white balance is way too blue. Now, how you want the image to come out is your own artistic representation. If you like a blue Milky Way, then that's fine. If you like it warmer, that's fine too. But here's how I do it. What I've found is if you up the vibrance, up the saturation way higher than you would ever planned to actually put it, you can get a good sense of where the white balance should be. So this is way too orange, way too blue. We want somewhere in the middle, somewhere where the core here is, it's orange color, it's supposed to be. There's some air glow you can see. And I like it leaning towards the blue slightly. That's just my personal preference. So I'd probably put it right about there at 41,033 Kelvin. And it's the same thing with the tint slider. You slide it too far to the left, too far to the right, and then you come back and try and find the sweet spot where you think it looks best. All right, so I'm pretty happy with that. I'm going to bring my vibrance back down. I'm going to bring my saturation back down. I'll leave a little bit of it in there. So now we're going to start from the top and work our way down. Start with the exposure slider. I'm going to slide it up just slightly. Brighten everything up a little bit. I'm going to take the contrast up just a little bit. And I'm going to leave the highlights alone for now. I'm going to bring the shadows up, which should bring in a little more detail in the foreground. And we got to be careful because we're pushing these sensors to the max when we shoot nighttime photography. If you want a cleaner result, I definitely suggest learning how to stack images or getting a tracking mount and exposing for the sky and then doing another exposure for the foreground and masking those together. I do have a tutorial where I go over how to stack images for noise reduction. I'll link that in the description below. Next, I'm going to bring my whites up slightly, and I might just leave the blacks alone. I'll bring them down just a little bit. So we're looking pretty bright. The sky's really bright. The foreground is probably too bright, so I'm going to bring that exposure back down a little bit. It's really just give and take. We're trying to get like a nice neutral base, and we're going to send this to Photoshop to do all the final touching up. Clarity, when it comes to nighttime images, I usually kind of leave it alone, or if I do use it, I'll use just very little, just a couple, let's say 4 points. We'll work our way down. You can give it a slight S-curve to start pumping in a little bit of the contrast that we're going to want, but a lot of the contrast adjustments I'll make later in Photoshop. I really don't mess with the HLS too much when doing the Milky Way processing. Sharpening, I just leave as is. The next big thing is to reduce the noise. And I know with the Sony A7RIII sensor, I can push this to about 40-ish and get a pretty good result. Because every camera's sensor is different, I definitely suggest doing your own tests and figuring out where the luminance, where you can push it to until it gets too mushy. Like I just push that up way high, wait for this to turn around. So everything's super, super mushy. Gross. So I've found, in my personal opinion, 40 is best. So we'll leave that as is. We'll keep working down. There's our lens profile correction. We put that on earlier. I'm not going to add any vignetting, and I'm not going to do any of the camera calibration. So what I might do before we send it off is just pump a little more saturation in there. Let's start kind of pushing the colors to where we want them to go. But we're still trying to leave it neutral. That way, when we get in Photoshop, we can really start adding contrast and saturation adjustments and doing a lot of fine tuning. All right, so overall, I'm pretty happy with that. I'm going to go ahead and right click on this. And we're going to go edit in and open in Adobe Photoshop CC 2018. All right, now we're in Photoshop. We have the image file sent over. And what I'm going to do to start off is I'm going to make a contrast adjustment, and I'm going to just do the sky. And how we do that is we go to our adjustments here. We add a curves layer. And I'm going to bring down the darks. We're going to darken down the sky. And I'm going to push up the highlights just a little bit. This is called an S curve. This would be a more defined S curve. The steeper you make this curve, the more contrasty it gets. These are all the darks, as you can see by this slider here. These are the darks of the image, and these are all the whites of the image. And then you have every tonal value in between. So if we bring down our darks, and I push the highlights up way too much, get it somewhere where you're kind of happy with how that looks. So now we see that we've made this adjustment and we've made the foreground darker. So if I turn this on and off, you can see that we've darkened down the foreground, which sometimes isn't a big deal, but this time I want to keep some of that detail in the foreground. So I'll go ahead and take this layer and I'll hit Command I for invert. Select the layer mask first and then hit Command I. And that turns it to black, so none of that's showing through. If I turn this layer on and off, nothing happens because it's masked out right now. So we're going to mask back in that contrast where we want it to be. This is a super, super useful technique. It's basically just adding whatever adjustment you'd like, adding a little bit more than you would like usually, and then inverting the mask. And then with a brush, if you hit B for brush, and all your brush controls are up here, so you can make them smaller brush, hardness. We're going to turn the hardness all the way down for us. And I'm going to start with a pretty big brush, maybe like 2,000 pixels or something. That'll work. All right, so with our brush selected and white showing here, if you don't have white, hit D on the keypad, and that defaults the colors. And another keystroke to learn is to hit X, and that flips the colors. Whatever is here, whatever is set to foreground goes to background, and background goes to foreground. So if I hit X again, we're back at white. So with our opacity turned down to like 10% and the flow turned down, I have it set to 27%. You can come in here and start really kind of painting in the effect. And this is kind of where, you know, an artistic influence comes into photography, in my opinion. You can really paint in things, make them more contrasty, add more saturation selectively. It's a really good way to really fine tune your image and get a result that you're really looking for and really that you had envisioned in the first place. So I'm just painting this in here slowly. I feel like Bob Ross. And if you want to see what you've done so far, you can hit the eyeball here and we can see that we've added quite a bit in there. I might just go ahead and turn my opacity up on my brush. And a quick way to do that is if you hit 10 or 1 on the keyboard, it makes it 10%. If you hit 2, it goes to 20%, 3 for 30, etc. If you hit 0, that gives you 100%. So I'm going to go in with a, let's say 30% brush. And I know I want a lot of contrast here in the core. I really want the core to stand out. So I'm just painting this in here. going over these darker areas, kind of pushing that contrast in. Something like that. And I might make a bigger brush here and just kind of give it a little once over there. Just kind of mix in some of that contrast all around. So if you want to see what you've done, you can hold Alt on the keyboard and click on the mask. And that's what we painted in so far. Everything that's white is being revealed. Everything that's black is concealed. So if you Alt click it again, it goes away. All right, so that's looking pretty good. What I might do is do another curves adjustment, and we're gonna get close up on the Milky Way here. And I'm gonna make another contrast adjustment, but I'm gonna push this really far. This is probably like way more than you would ever really want to put in there. So that's craziness. Like, you probably wouldn't want to put out an image like that. That's just too much. I might even add a little bit more. But the key here is to come down to that adjustment layer that you just put in. Click on the mask, Command I, and that takes it away. We're gonna hit B again for brush. And I'm gonna scale down my brush. And if you're wondering, I have a Wacom tablet. It's just a cheap one. I think it was under $100. And it makes this painterly effect way easier to put in, and actually gives it more of like an artistic feel, where you can add, different amounts of opacity the harder you push on the pen, etc. There's a lot of really cool inputs you can use here. So I highly suggest getting one. All right, so back to the image. We've made a smaller brush, and I'm gonna go to 10% on the opacity again. And I'm just gonna come in here to these darker areas. I may even go up to 20%. I really want to darken down these areas. So I'm just painting in. I really like to come in here to, I call it the dark horse. Kind of looks like a horse, like that's his front leg, back leg, and his head. So I'm going to darken him down, make him stand out a little bit more. We're not just darkening down, we're adding contrast, like lots of contrast really. So lighter area is going to get lighter. So if you want this to kind of stand out a little bit more, this light area here, you can paint in there. And this is where it all comes into, your artistic expression. You get to choose how much you put in and how much you take out. So I just made a bigger brush. I'm just making a bigger overall adjustment here. And I really like to give this area a little bit more contrast, because there is this like dark trail that comes out here and loops back around. So I like to darken that down. And I like to go over some of these stars out here with this and give them a little bit more contrast. All right, it's really standing out. So let's see what we did. On, off, on, off, on. So again, we made an adjustment. We inverted the mask so that adjustment goes away. And we selectively paint in what we want to be there. All right, so we went ahead and I think the sky looks pretty darn good. I'm pretty happy with that. So what I'm going to do now is I might try and make an adjustment to the foreground. I don't know if this is going to work out, but we're going to give it a shot. So I'm going to select somewhere down here in the mid-tones. I really want to push. I'm really just looking here in this area. So we have a pretty light tone here and dark tones here, and I would just want to add a little more contrast in between those. So I'm just guessing that these tones are like in this area. So if I bring that up, they definitely get brighter. If I come down the curve a little bit and push up, they definitely get brighter. Trying to find that sweet spot. That's pretty good. And then I want to, now the darks are, lifted up. So I want to bring those back down. Let's say something like that. We don't want to make it too bright. This image is shot at night. It's dark out. So it shouldn't be very bright here. We just want enough tonal detail that it's believable. It looks like nighttime. So we can tell that this adjustment made our sky look like crap. The foreground still doesn't look great. I'm going to actually bring down the darks a little bit. If I slide down this S curve, I'm only affecting now the darker darks, which is what I really want. I just want the darkest darks to get crushed down. And I want these lighter darks, or more mid-tone parts of the image, to be brighter. Cool, that's not bad. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to select the layer mask, Command I for invert, and hit B for brush. And so we're going to scale up the brush tool here. And with white selected and a small opacity, I'm going to go, I'm just going to leave it on 20%. I'm just going to lightly brush in on the tree just to bring out a little more detail in here. And because we're using such a low opacity brush, you don't have to be super accurate. You can be a little sloppy. On some of my bigger images that I know I'm going to print large, I definitely do take the time to go in and make sure that this is all perfect. But for the speed of this tutorial, I'm just going to go ahead and rush through it. So I'm just selectively adding in some of that contrast we put in. Maybe we can throw a little bit on that branch. All right, not a huge difference, but it's all these little adjustments that we make that make the big change in the end. So that's looking pretty good. I'm definitely seeing some magentas sneaking in here. That tends to happen when you shoot super high ISO, long exposure photography. An easy way to get rid of that is to simply just add a hue and saturation layer. Go to the magentas. And if you push them all the way up, you can really see where it's at. Definitely on the edges here. So let's go ahead and just take it out. Like most of the way out, like 91. And then the lightness, I might just darken it down a little bit. There may even be a little bit of red in here. Yeah. So I just went to the reds on that same hue and saturation layer. And I'm just taking that out. There's a lot of hot pixels in this image when you zoom in. That's pretty typical of nighttime photography. An easy way to get rid of them is to simply just add a new layer by clicking this button here. And making sure, then we want to select the spot healing brush tool. And then we want to make sure that we have checked sample all layers. And that'll make sure that we stamp using all these layers so we get the same effect. So you can quickly and easily just come in here and just start clicking around. It takes forever to go through and really clean it up, but it really does make a big difference in the end. You really do get a better result. So I'm not going to go do that for the sake of speed for this tutorial. You can go in and keep doing that yourself. So overall, I'm pretty happy with how this image looks. We could add a vignette if we'd like, and maybe we'll do that. So the way to do that is we should probably just stamp this as a new layer. So if you hold Shift, Option, Command, E, that pastes the new layer with all of our adjustments just on the new layer. So we're going to take this layer, make sure that's selected. We go to Filter, go to Lens Correction. I know it seems counterintuitive that we remove the vignette at the beginning and now we're adding it back in. But what this does is we made all those adjustments, and then if we add the vignette back on top, it becomes more believable and interesting, and doesn't have that crappy fall off. We can decide how it falls off. So if we go over here to custom, one of the things that might happen to you is these corrections might be already checked when you come in to this. Go ahead and turn those off, and then go over to the custom tab. Now we're going to add a vignette, and we want to go to the left with it. So let's take it to the extreme so we can see what we're doing. So that darkens it down pretty good. That's probably farther than I want to take it. And then you can adjust the midpoint as well. And that's just how far this vignette's down towards the middle. So if we push it up, that goes up away, the midpoint goes up away. If we bring it down, it brings it down towards the center. So this is where we can be really, particular and get an effect that we're really going for. I really want that to kind of just fall all the way to the tree. I want the viewer's eye to kind of hit the tree and then the Milky Way. So I move the midpoint all the way up to +7, and I'm going to take down the vignette a little bit. I think it's too strong. The edges are just completely dark. And again, this is all choice. You just figure out what works for you. So that's looking pretty good. We just hit OK. Now we can kind of see what we did if I turn that layer on and off. It really helps hide those imperfect corners. All that magenta and red we sucked out of there. It can add like weird color discrepancies, and the vignette just kind of covers it up, puts a band-aid on it. So that's looking pretty good. From this point, I would save this image, and I'll just do that anyways. So we go File, Save As, and I'll just call it Milky Way. I'll just call it Milky Way, and save it as a Photoshop document. Make sure you save the layers. Now, the reason for doing that at this point is now you have a record of every adjustment you made to this image. So you can go back and say you think it might be too contrasty. You can adjust that later and just re-export it out, no big deal. All right, so that's saved out, and that is now my master file for this image. I have the raws I can always go back to and start from ground zero if I'd like. But now I have an adjusted image here, and you can do whatever you'd like with it. So what I'm going to do now is prepare this image for the web, which is where most of us display most of our work nowadays. And to do that, I usually don't try and use plugins in my tutorials that you have to pay for, but I really do suggest going ahead and buy this TK Actions panel from Tony Kuiper. I'll put a link in the description below to it. I think it's $10-15. I don't think it's that expensive, and it makes a huge difference when we do web sharpening. So that's what we're going to go into now. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to flatten this image. Just select everything, right click, flatten image. And that gives us just a flat image to work off of. I'll double click that, turn it into a new layer. And from this point, we're going to go to the Actions panel, go to Actions, and down here is the Web Sharpening. I usually do 2500 pixels for my final dimensions. Some people do smaller, some people do larger. It's up to you. I've found 2500 to kind of be the sweet spot, especially with my 5K iMac. Having a slightly bigger than normal web image looks nice. So what I have to do now is just simply hit OK. And you want to select Fit, and that just makes 2500 pixels be whichever the long end is. So we just hit OK. It does its magic for us. And now we have a web sharpened image. If you turn this is the actual sharpened part, and this is just the background. So if you turn that off and then back on, I don't know if you can see that in YouTube, but it makes a hell of a difference. It gives it that over sharpened look, which is pretty popular nowadays. So it's usually at this point that I will make refinements to the saturation. Sometimes I add a little more contrast in at this point. It really depends on the image. I know with this one, if we're going to put it on the web, we should go ahead and just turn the saturation up a little bit. Everyone loves saturation. So let's just blast that up some. Something like that. I'm only looking at the sky. I feel like the foreground might be a little too saturated at this point. So what I'll do is I'll select the layer mask, and I'll hit B for brush, and I will change the color to black So if you hit X on the keyboard, that flips those colors. And now when I paint, I'm going to conceal that adjustment rather than reveal like we were doing earlier. And I just want to take away some of this saturation in here so it's not super crazy looking. And again, this is all to taste. It's whatever you want. If you think it looks good like that, have at it. I'm just going in here with a 20% brush, just hitting these highly saturated areas and just bringing them down a little bit. I might do a big brush here for the whole foreground. Just give that a good old once over until I feel like it looks good. And when you first learn these techniques, it's really easy to go overboard with them. I really suggest just taking the time, look around at other people's work, and get a sense of how much is, desirable for you and how much is probably going to be too far. Because I know when I started first doing this, I would just push things way too far and it just looked kind of crazy. And looking back on it now, I'm like, what was I thinking? All right, so pretty happy with that at this point. It's nice and saturated, nice and contrasty. The colors look great. The foreground's dark, but still you can see it, so it's like kind of eerie. We have all the hot pixels still, so we don't have a super clean looking image, but a good 20-30 minutes, you can have all those taken care of, and it's worthwhile to do. So at this point, I would just save the image. So you come back over here to the TK action panel, and you hit Save for Web, and it's going to make sure you put out a JPEG, hi, and you hit Save, and you would save it wherever you'd like. I'm going to just save it. Sure, whatever, that's fine. Save it there. So that's it for my tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, drop them below. If you have anything else you'd like to learn, just let me know below. I'd really love to see what you guys want to learn, so let me know. Other than that, thanks for watching. Have a good day.